Before this video starts, if you enjoy this video, there are many more like it already on the channel with many more like it to come in the future, so subscribe. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it. I upload 6 days a week on this channel, so if you're looking for some consistent basketball talk, this is a place for it. Also, drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. I am very close to hitting 100K, so if you could subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. So, Paul George has been pretty fucking questionable in the playoffs so far. And to be fair, he did bounce back in Game 5, but in Games 2, 3, and 4, George was not only bad, he was historically bad. His numbers over that 3-game period were the worst in the playoffs since Bob Cousy in 1960. The last time an NBA player played this bad in a 3-game stretch of playoff games was before a man had set foot on the moon and before John F. Kennedy made the mistake of driving in a convertible. Unfortunately for JFK, it wasn't up to Paul George to take that shot back then because he would have been just fine if it was. And when this streak of horrible basketball was going down, there was a good amount of people posting a list of everything that the Los Angeles Clippers gave up in order to trade for Paul George. And I said list because, well, the amount of shit that the Clippers gave to OKC needs a list's worth of space to write out. 5 goddamn first-round picks, guaranteed picks, mind you, as well as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who you can pretty confidently say is going to be a star player in the coming seasons. So that doesn't look great, and the question is, and the question I'm going to attempt to answer with this video, is did the Clippers give up too much in order to get Paul George? Let's find out. I don't know why I introduced these like it's some hip 2000s science show with like Bill Nye or some shit, but whatever. Let's find out. So let's take an exact look at everything included in this deal for Paul George. The Thunder got the Clippers 2022 first, 2024 first, 2026 first, 2 first-rounders from the Miami Heat for 2021 and 2023, as well as the right to swap picks with the Clippers for 2023 and 2025. And of course, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, as well as Danilo Gallinari, who was a salary filler, but also a pretty damn solid NBA player as well. So really, when I said the Clippers traded 5 firsts, I meant 5 guaranteed. There are 2 other first-round picks that could hypothetically be swapped. And depending on how good those teams are at the time, that could be a big deal or not a deal at all. And if we take a look at the years on those picks, by 2026, which is the last first-round pick in this deal, Kawhi Leonard is going to be 35 years old. George is going to be 36 years old. And when we look at the track record with both of these two in their careers, they don't really stick around for one place too long, and especially they don't stick around when things start to go bad. Paul George stayed in Indiana for like 2 bad years. Then after saying he had unfinished business in OKC, he forced a trade out of town after 1 year on the contract. Kawhi left the Spurs as soon as things got weird between him and Pop and that whole cult of an organization, and he even left the Raptors when things were already going well. That's not to mention the fact that when Kawhi joined the Clippers, he only signed a 2+1 deal so that he could leave if he wanted to. Kawhi is stepping into Los Angeles with a foot already out of the door if necessary. If Kawhi was one to stick in one place for a while, he would have signed a 5-year max contract, but he very clearly wins about being able to compete for championships no matter what, wherever he goes. So he's ready to leave when he needs to. Now, whether or not you think that's a positive with those players, or you think it's a knock or whatever, that's irrelevant to what it means for the franchise, because the future is in question 1 season from now, let alone fucking 6. And if Kawhi and George leave, odds are the Clippers are going to be bad for a while. They'd have assets and cap space, so it would be possible to turn it around, but I wouldn't bet on it. So that 2026 pick and even that 2025 pick swap could be very fruitful for the OKC Thunder. There is a middle schooler out there that is going to be a big deal for the Thunder potentially. I guess we'll see in a few years when I'm 26 years old and either a successful YouTuber or living on the street because my career went to shit. Isn't contemplating the future fun? But that is the pick situation. Now I want to talk about the players that were moved. The Clippers in this deal traded SGA, who by all accounts is going to be a future all-star player. Now, I will say I think there are a good handful of people that overrate Shai a good amount. I wouldn't say he's overrated in general because there are also a lot of people that he's not even on their radar for, but there are people who take it a step too far with him. At his peak, I expect Shai to be like a 21-4-4 guy on good splits with good defense at the 2 guard position, because I believe he isn't a point guard because his playmaking is okay at best. And for his offense, he has a great feel for the game, but he has an over-reliance on mid-range pull-ups, which is not great. I love the mid-range game, and I do not dismiss it as a bad shot as many proponents of modern basketball do. However, it is less than ideal to have that as a foundation of your game in 2020. It's a similar problem to what DeMar DeRozan has. Now, Shai's outside jumper isn't nearly as bad as DeRozan's, but it's also not good. This year, he shot just under 35% from 3 on 3.6 attempts, which is a league average percentage, and I went down every starting shooting guard in the NBA, and Shai is tied for the 4th lowest in attempts at his position, just above Jeremy Lamb, Jimmy Butler, and DeMar DeRozan, which is not good company in terms of shooting. The guy was tied in attempts per game with Jarrett Culver, also not good company in terms of shooting. Or in the case of Culver, not good company, period. So a shooting guard who is not much of a shooter is not a player that I would project to be a superstar level talent by any means. But regardless of that, assuming that the competition is not crazy, Shai is going to be a multiple-time All-Star. So, certainly a good piece to have. And for what it's worth, Danilo Gallinari is a pretty damn good player, but he doesn't have any long-term implications from being traded here for the Clippers. Now let's actually talk about what the Clippers got back in Paul George. Now, it is worth mentioning that when the Clippers traded for George, he had just come off the best season of his career where he is an MVP candidate averaging an efficient 28 points per game. In Los Angeles, he reverted back to what he was the year prior. That was partially because he took a lesser role, but this was also the first year George had displayed any it factor, and that was apparently a one-season thing because it was gone with the Clippers. And this year specifically, while he has had some health struggles which are worth considering, he definitely dropped down in the ranks in the NBA, partly because some players moved up the ladder, but George would move down a lot even without that. So George has not been as good as advertised. However, I also don't think he's nearly as bad as some people have made him out to be. I consider him one of the greatest second options ever. And yeah, he was bad in the playoffs, and I overreacted like everybody else does, but I don't think he's going to be this bad consistently. He's probably going to have 1 or 2 more dud games here or there, but that's kind of what you get with George regardless. That's nothing new. I think he's going to be fine. Also, part of this struggle was some mental health stuff with the bubble, which is understandable, and I hope he does well from here on. But in summary, George has not been as good as advertised, and the Clippers gave up a future All-Star as well as multiple first-round picks in exchange for him. Like, really, that many first-round picks being traded is truly absurd, because that is between 5 and 7 young players on top of Shai for George. So, in the end, was the Paul George trade worth it? Abso-fucking-lutely it was worth it. Why? You don't get Paul George, you don't get Kawhi Leonard. That simple. The reason Kawhi went to the Clippers was because they landed another star player. If they don't land a star player, they don't get Kawhi. So while on the surface it appears that the Clippers traded a whole lot for Paul George, in reality they traded a whole lot for Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, which is a whole nother package. Look, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and 5 firsts is certainly more than you should be giving up for a guy who isn't even a top 10 player. However, it is a pretty reasonable price to pay for that player and then the best player in the NBA on top of that. When you look at this trade individually in a vacuum, yeah, it's a stupid ass trade, but without making that trade, you don't get Kawhi Leonard, so it is worth it. And you might say, oh well, it is still a stupid ass trade. I would agree. I just said it was a stupid ass trade because they did give up more than they needed. However, based on how this news was reported and how last second everything was, It really appears like they were rushed to make a decision quickly. People had been waiting on Kawhi Leonard to announce his decision forever, and basically when it was the deadline for him to do so, he signed with the Clippers pretty much last second, so it's understandable that this trade was put together in haste. The trade was far from ideal, but also the circumstances were far from ideal, so you kind of get what you get. Could you have put together a more fair trade with more time on the clock? Of course. I think Shea and like 3 or 4 firsts would be more than enough. But there wasn't much time on the clock, and at the end of the day, the Clippers are in a lot better of a place now than they were before. The odds are pretty high that the Clippers will win a championship within the next couple of seasons, assuming that Kawhi and PG pick up their options after the next season or re-sign to a new deal. So as a result, even though they traded a lot, they likely traded a lot for a championship, and even if they didn't actually get a championship out of it, you still take that chance 10 times out of 10. So in conclusion, yeah, the Paul George trade was still worth it, and Jerry West is still a motherfucking messiah. That is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.